What's going on, Cylinder Radio listeners? If you're interested in the nuance of dialogue and things like that, check out my freebie, download, Debate to Dialogue, How to Have Productive Conversations About Politics and Religion. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles, trying to bring viewpoint diversity and complex nuance to controversial topics and make commentary on things going on in society. My guest today is a friend that I met online, and then you meet these people after having relationships with them online, and then you meet them in person. You're like, oh, you're a real person and everything like that. And he's here in town. Liam de Boer. He's a videographer, a cultural critic who makes really awesome videos for social media that have an Andrew Schultz kind of vibe to them, commenting on craziness out in the world and tyranny and all that kind of stuff. And I thought this was a great opportunity to talk about, he's a Canadian, so to talk about the corruption in government and how it is the same and differs between United States and Canada. So Liam, good to see you, man.
Great to be here, man.
Yeah,
thanks for having me out. Yeah, like you said, it's whenever you were talking about whether we do this in person or later on and over Zoom, I was like, no, we got to make sure it's in person.
Yeah.
It's completely different.
It's better.
For sure.
Yeah, it's very interesting too. I'm going to have a kind of free download coming out about how you can use social media to benefit you and make you better, stronger, faster, smarter, whatever, as opposed to the opposite of those. And one of the things I'm including on that is personal relationships. I've actually grown friendships with people that I met online just through a screen, and then we meet in person and get along or whatever it is, work together or whatever it is. And I think it can be great. It's supposed to be social network. It's supposed to be.
Well, and I think a lot of people, to that point, a lot of people will talk to me and be like, oh, aren't you afraid of saying all this kind of stuff online? Because, yeah, a lot of my content could be considered controversial as well, for sure. And it's been, the vast majority of it has been way overwhelmingly positive.
Yeah.
And I think the only time that online stuff starts to backfire in that end at all is when you start actually having a large enough voice that kind of starts making some changes. And then it's when the people that really have it out for you start going after, say, your sponsors or your advertisers or your clients or whatever it may be. But at that point, too, I already think about it. It's I've kind of planned it out as well, just being all right, if that ever happens, got to steer into the skid.
Yeah.
You got to just accept it and just know that that's coming on. But so I think social media, for the most part, can be extremely helpful. Yeah, like you were saying.
And it's not going anywhere. So
No.
you just use it to your advantage. I mean, you say that about AI, a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
So your content is, we were talking about this last night, you're over for dinner, and we were talking about what is the driver? My content, I said my content is kind of driving to, heal the wounds of society to some degree. It's like that school teacher, this all started me. And you said that it was standing up to tyranny.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that really hit me. I was like, oh, that makes sense with the stuff you put out there, using these channels of a bullhorn on your phone. Where does that come from in you? Have you always been that way? A little punk rock, pushing back to the man and stuff like that? Or?
It's funny. I think about that quite a bit, and I haven't always been that way outspokenly, but I think I always have been kind of behind closed doors. Because growing up, I always listened to metal music, and it was, Metallica, Lamb of God, Rage Against the Machine, all of these groups. And then I've thought about it now and how much that probably did orient my worldview.
Yeah.
So I don't think I've ever been, I was never the guy that was battling people at dinner tables or getting into those kind of conversations. I've always, most of the time, other than social media, kept my opinions to myself. But so I think that definitely played a major part in crafting my worldview.
But it wasn't about you enjoyed confrontation, you enjoyed arguing with people.
I was terrified.
Yeah.
I put that first video out because the first video I ever did, I never planned on getting into social media. I never thought, okay, I want to become a social commentator, and this is how I'm going to go about it. This will be my angle, and then started doing it. It was during lockdowns. I went home and was talking to my parents and a couple different friends, and I had been talking about people's mental health declining, everybody that had lost their jobs. At what point are we going to sit here and say that we're doing a lot more damage than we are controlling damage? And then everybody was just kind of oh, I haven't really even heard many people talking about this side, because this was in December of 2020, so It still hadn't even been a year of COVID yet. And then so it was when talking about lockdowns, against lockdowns, was just as controversial as talking against vaccines now.
Yeah.
Or, well, maybe not as much now, but at one point. So I just literally spur of the moment was fuck, somebody's got to say something about this. So after dinner, I went downstairs, set up my camera because I was doing videography, just recorded, wrote a script in about an hour, put it out. And then just the reaction was just crazy to it, where both sides of the aisle, both pro-lockdown and anti-lockdown, because I didn't make it just so much about like, F these lockdowns, blah, 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 F those people. I wasn't just being angry. It was kind of like, is nobody thinking about this side of things at all? I told a few stories about friends that I knew who had got into, say, like lost their jobs and got into drug dealing, or I told a story about a lawyer that used to come to the brewery that I worked at, and he actually lived right above it. And within like 6 months of COVID, all of a sudden he was coming in buying a 2.6 of vodka and a 6-pack of beer every day. He'd gained like 30, 40 pounds. One day he even showed up with like a black eye. And before COVID, he was a highly successful lawyer. That was the side that I put. And then, yeah, so I've just been kind of rolling with it ever since then.
Yeah, and the content's great. And you're really talented at like the editing and the way it's entertaining. It's like quick, really quick. With the jokes, it's quick. With the commentary, it's quick. And yeah, it's not like shitting on Democrats alone or the Labor Party alone or the Conservatives alone. It's not that. It's like trying to aim for like the common sense arguments and perspectives that most people resonate with, unless you're on like those polls where you're like stuck in your ideological tribe. I think most people go like, oh yeah, that at least is going to spark some thought.
Yeah,
which is a big thing that I'm
well.
all about.
If I was to say what I'm mostly speaking against is, I'm not trying to speak out against liberals or whatever. I do aim myself kind of against this whole World Economic Forum UN Agenda 2030. That's what I like. I look at the Agenda 2030 and I'm like, this is just tyranny wrapped up into kind of wishful thinking.
Can you explain that to me? Because there is an element of the World Economic Forum that was like just Alex Jones conspiracy theory nonsense, and then it got exposed to like, no, this is actually going on. Like, this is a real thing. You know, the Great Reset is a conspiracy theory. It's like, no, they wrote a book called The Great Reset. You know, like a lot of stuff was kind of surreptitious, under the radar, but now there's getting so much attention with Joe Rogan and people like that talking about it with these massive platforms. People start looking at it, and this year a lot less like big, household name people went. Because Klaus Schwab and his crazy outfits and everything like that. But can you explain the 2030 agenda and what is the World Economic Forum for the people who are listening who are like, oh, I've heard that said online or whatever it is. I heard Glenn Beck talk about it or Russell Brand, but it's just interesting that Russell Brand and Glenn Beck. You know what I mean? That's what's so crazy. That's why I think there's something to calling it out. If Glenn Beck and Russell Brand are on the same page about this being dangerous, is something that goes, okay, well, let's look into it.
Yeah.
Can you explain it a little bit?
Well, yeah, no, if you look at the World Economic Forum, essentially what it is it's the amalgamation of corporate and public sectors, which is by definition how fascism is described. And it's funny, it's like the people that subscribe to this agenda, which I'll break down in a second, the Agenda 2030 and all its goals, are the ones that are so keen to call everybody fascists. And it's like, this is the merger. We're seeing it hand in hand with the whole ESG scores. And that's essentially what the whole Agenda 2030 breaks down to, is diversity, equity, inclusivity, and sustainability. It's kind of those tenets. And what's happening is they're forcing these public government style tyranny through corporate sectors with things like ESG scores and
which is environmental, social governance. Yeah.
So it's these different factors, and that is it's modern day social credit score.
Yeah.
And it's okay. What are you doing for equity, diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and sustainability? And if you hit certain ones of these markers, then you get a higher score. And how you get a higher score depends on whether your banks will lend to you properly, your tax breaks, all of this kind of stuff. So there's a financial incentive built into it to push this agenda through, and I really don't see any difference between that and social credit scores at all.
Like, if I'm going to try and just like steel man that side, I think that you could definitely argue against this, but you could say like, these people are powerful people, the Bill Gates of the world or whoever they are, okay, that the gospel of wealth type of thing. Like, I was put in this position with a lot of resources. I'm going to try and do good. And this is what I believe to be good. I'm capable. I built these billion-dollar companies. So give me some power and I will make sure that I will do good. I mean, Bill Gates was responsible for making waterless toilets and giving malaria nets to people in Africa and everything. Like there are, he's done some crazy stuff too, but those positive elements of it. ESG scores, how do we promote, better environmental practices, like don't dump toxic waste in the rivers and stuff. Let's create this score. Like I could understand how that happens, but then you also have to understand human nature of how that gets out of control. Is, you come in with these good intentions, then you get a ton of resources and a ton of power. And then it's so easy once you take out all the speed bumps from any kind of obstruction into your pathway. And it's very hard to stay on a benevolent path. It's very easy to go skew off in one direction, especially because there's all these gates to even get access to you. I mean, who is actually in Bill Gates' ear or people like him?
Somebody like Bill Gates, for instance, the way that I look at it is I go, okay, he was one of the most hated businessmen in the 1990s because he was known for being a ruthless monopolizer, being, just like terrible business practices. So I look at it and I go, okay, everybody knows that you need the public on your side. You need the masses to be in line with whatever you're doing to be successful, especially on that scale. What better way than to rebrand yourself as a humanitarian? Kind of like, all right, let's wash away this whole view of me being this ruthless capitalist, and then I'll paint myself as this philanthropic guy. And I mean, you look at it and you go, he's monopolizing world health. Sure, and don't get me wrong, you could, argue that there is definitely pluses that come out of that, but he's profiting massively off of that. And then even me, like myself, I look at that and I go, well, look, just people shouldn't be like, Mr. Beast is a great example of somebody that gets flack for doing all these good things, and it's like, okay, he just wants this attention. But I think there is one of those things where it's kind of like, okay, I think Mr. Beast just genuinely likes doing that stuff. But then you look and you listen to Bill Gates long enough, you listen to him in interviews, you look at, say, past ties to people like Epstein and working closely with these people. Like what? He was 20-something times he's met with Epstein. Like it's been crazy.
I don't know, but he's lied about it. He said it was like one dinner or something like that, and there's proof that it wasn't. So
and even his wife talked out.
That was a reason why they got divorced.
Yeah,
or something like that.
It was like, Bill asked me to meet with this guy, and she's like, I couldn't stand being around him for more than 30 seconds. I look at that and I go, to me, that whole world seems much more like, okay, we've got these kind of pathological ideas as to what we want to put through and control, and I think it's just all a mask. This virtuous stuff is being kind of tossed around as a mask for it all. Because even if you look at it, if you go, okay, even if you are trying to aim and do this good, how is, for instance, with those ESG scores, like the social credit, how does Raytheon have a higher ESG score than Tesla?
Yeah.
There has to be something out of whack in your whole thing because of this. And I mean, even too, we see it with the whole greenwashing in corporate, like, they'll talk about how it's like, okay, it's we're net zero by this time. And it's like, well, all they have to do is buy carbon credits, which are, okay, we'll give this amount of money to offset our carbon. And it's like, you're not actually net zero. You're just giving money to essentially erase the fact that you're emitting.
All over taking private jets there, and that's what they're doing. I mean, Andrew Carnegie says something along the lines of like, you break up your life into thirds, you learn as much as you can, you make as much money as you can, then you give it all away, or something along those lines. So you can cover that up and say like, well, build museums and build libraries and stuff like that. But what some of these guys, like, again, we'll just stick on Gates for now because there's several like him, George Soros or others. Like what they're doing is trickier. It's more chess related, where it comes to like buying up farmland and then promoting a lot of vegan diets. Like, is there some sort of connection there? Why are you buying all these cattle ranches and then promoting a vegan diet? Like, what's going on here? And it's not that crazy. Like, it's really not. Like all this tinfoil hat stuff. If you boil it down to a smaller, like just a small town or a small business, you're going to try and talk to your local, city council person to allow you to do something to promote your business. And as that grows, you become one of the richest people on the planet, some of the most powerful people on the planet. It could be through a monarchy, it could be through, royalty, it could be through business, it could be through politics. Why would you not play that same game? It's like when people say like, it's really disgusting how rich people try and get out of taxes, but they're like a nanny, or they work at a pizza shop that works on the table. It's like, you're a babysitter. You don't pay taxes. Like, oh, well, that's different because I'm not making a lot of money. It's actually not different. Like, that's the whole point, is that your behavior, your morality is your morality. And when it grows to scale, you keep that same morality. So Bill Gates is probably who he's always been. It's that concept of power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But maybe it's that power reveals, wealth reveals. And it reveals who you are more so if you take all those speed bumps out, all the hurdles out of your life, that's really like more genuinely who you are to some degree.
Yeah. No, I agree with that statement wholeheartedly, pretty much. And I think what's happening with the World Economic Forum is you look at this, they always meet in Davos, Switzerland, and they get together in these meetings, and it's essentially a closed door meeting, like only like accredited journalists, like, the New York Times get in there.
Ryan Stelter.
Yeah, exactly. And those are the only people that are allowed to get in there and listen to these conversations that are happening and then report back to the public on them. You see independent journalists in the street try to talk to these people and they immediately shove them off, or they, sometimes they even get they kind of verbally attack them, all this kind of stuff. Essentially, to me, is so politicians get in for free, corporations have to pay a certain amount of money. I can't remember what the exact dollar amount was, but it's something like $50,000 a head kind of thing. And it's like, okay, you are paying as a corporation, these world corporations, and you can go look on the World Economic Forum's website as to list of all their partners, and you can, it's like the who's who of corporations.
Yeah.
And it's essentially them paying for access to a closed-door conversation with public sector employees.
Yeah, which takes us to the topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which is, corruption. You mentioned Rage Against the Machine, which is one of my favorite bands of all time. I think it really had an impact on me in the stuff that I'm doing now. And it's so interesting. I broke down Killing in the Name of, which is like one of their most famous songs, but I broke down the lyrics during COVID. And it was really interesting how much that resonated with the people that were saying, like, I'm not sitting down, I'm not staying in my house, I'm not wearing the mask. That's the machine. Yeah. You can't say that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden are the minority anymore. They're not the ones rage against the machine. It's not, like Nicole Hannah-Jones or someone like that, 1690 Project. You are the machine. And the fact that people have skewed that, because it used to be different. It used to be different about who was the machine, but now the people we're talking about, these powerful positions, people running these institutions, that's the machine, and you have to basically rise up against that, not let them manipulate and all the things that we're seeing now. And it's like, you go back and listen to Rage Against the Machine now, it's like, this is exactly what we're talking about, and it doesn't split along the lines. I love, what's the guitar player's name?
Tom Morello.
Tom Morello. I love Tom Morello, but like, he is so political now on like the political left. It's like, wait a second, like, you weren't a Bill Clinton supporter. Like, what are you talking about? It wasn't like that. It wasn't a Democrat Republican thing. It was the government thing. It was the powerful corporation thing. Why are you leaning on one side of this now? And I think that it's just so easy if you're not looking deep into it, like you and I kind of do. We're like nerds about this stuff. Then it's so easy to just go like, oh, well, these are the good guys because.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you either die a hero or live longer.
Oh, they got so successful.
But, and I think that is kind of what happens is, if you are, they were essentially a voice for the common folk, and now they are kind of removed from that whole world. And it is, I think, easy to get, like, I'll still listen to their music. I'm not one of these people that are like, oh, now you have political views of me, now I won't listen to you or anything like that. But
so good. But
I do agree that they have definitely twisted, and you even see some of the visuals that go on during their shows, and it just looks like left-wing propaganda, and you're like, what the heck is going on here? But I do think that is one of these, what I have a hard time wrapping my head around, especially in that regards, is so much of the left-wing propaganda looks like it is anti-establishment, but then you look at all the solutions to those problems that they lay out, and I can actually get on board with a lot of those problems, but where I disagree with them is on the solutions, because a lot of their solutions just look like give the establishment more power.
Yeah.
It's really weird. Like, it's like, okay, wealth inequality is out of control. Okay, well, we need to raise taxes, give more money to the government, the system, and then they'll redistribute it equally. And it's like, that's never happened before.
Yeah, there's some things, like Canadian things I want to talk about. I think there's a good parlay into the truckers issue. So, you might, people listening might remember, you might not, because now there's always something to just like move on from it. But essentially, and I might get this wrong, you can tell me, but like, it was essentially, there were mandates on getting vaccinated for truckers to like cross the border, and the truckers said no. And so there's this massive caravan across the whole country of Canada across to get to Ottawa, right, the capital, and there was like all this stuff about labeling them as they were racist and they were terrible. People were running fundraisers, and then the fundraisers like GoFundMe actually stole those funds and directed them somewhere else. And then they said like, oh, it's a very small movement, but meanwhile they're putting laws up for even standing on the streets to support them. And truckers, though, that's the common folk. Nothing's more blue collar, common folk than truckers. Hardworking, Canadians and Americans, grease under their fingernails type of people, and being mandated by a government to do something that they didn't feel was best for them, that they didn't think was healthy for them, forcing something into their bodies. This goes back to the Tuskegee experiments and everything like that. It was really shocking when I was watching that go on in Canada, because Canada and America kind of watch each other, I think, to some degree. It's like, oh, what's happening over there could come here, and vice versa. But you made some commentary on the truckers. What's kind of your take on that? And where was I kind of wrong in the analysis of that? But like, what is your take on that whole thing?
You were pretty spot on. One thing was that I think it was like 90% of truckers, even while the protest was going on, 90% were vaccinated. So it wasn't even like these people.
They were in solidarity with the caravan, even though they were vaccinated.
Yeah. So like most of the truckers, and don't get me wrong, the truckers that protested were probably overrepresented of the unvaccinated. Like not every trucker joined this protest, right? So maybe a lot of the vaccinated ones.
A lot did, though. I mean, what was the numbers? I forget what the numbers. It was a
lot, and it was big, especially off the start. And yeah, it was one of those things where it immediately, like, it was just lies upon lies got tossed at the trucker convoy, and that's where everybody's brain kind of melted. And like, even me, like, I had friends message me and be like, you're becoming a fascist, like throwing that word around. It's just like, okay,
truckers.
It's like, okay, because I was supporting the truckers. But what was interesting was how quickly it went from, okay, these people are just a fringe minority, to use Trudeau's words, to all of a sudden they are a danger to our democracy. Like, oh, don't even worry about them. They're just this small little group, to all of a sudden they're the worst people on earth and they're here to destroy the government. It
was like a domestic violent terrorism thing. Yeah. Like, that's why they cut the funding.
Yeah.
Because like, we're funding like an outside government funding people or something like that.
Yeah, but they even found afterwards, even the GoFundMe CEO brought up those numbers, and it was like 8% were foreign funds or something like that. Like 92% of it was within Canada. And pretty much every accusation that got tossed at them got thrown out. Like, there was a Nazi flag that showed up, and this is just speculation, but it's very interesting because the photographer that got the pictures of the Nazi flag, somebody else took a picture of him, and he looked awfully a lot like Trudeau's personal photographer. And like, it was like you could see face by face, and you're like, oh yeah, that's pretty similar. And so that ended up being a whole thing where there was even a video too that came out. There was a Confederate flag at the protest, and immediately, they take pictures and then they run it on the head of every single news outlet, and it's like, okay, this is just some like alt-right protest. And then you see crowd footage, and people were like, hey, get out of here, like, we don't want this here, blah blah blah, like, and then kicked the guy with the Confederate flag out. And again, it's like, we know that these things happen, no matter what side it's on, whether it's, it just came out with the Black Lives Matter stuff about agent provocateurs. Same thing with January 6th.
Yep.
They'll put people into these scenarios to either rile it up or paint it one way so that they can then go in and say, okay, this is what this whole crowd is like, and then shut it down.
Yeah. And I mean, that's been done through history with, like, putting like agents in with the hippies to throw stuff and be violent towards Vietnam vets to show that hippies were violent. I mean, this is something that's been going on. They've poisoned alcohol back in the Prohibition days to build fear for that. Like, that is kind of the go-to. The patterns of history. It's why I like being a history teacher. Is like, it's just so you have a watchful eye for, like, okay, history might not repeat itself, but it definitely rhymes. The way that all went down, especially when it's like, even if there was a Nazi trucker, there might have been one or two. Was there a racist trucker? Yeah, probably. There's probably racist people in your family, guys. Like, these people exist. But to say they're all bad because of one or two, like, you want to play that game? You want to play the game of there's one or two, like, oh, I got jumped by a young black man, so now all young black men are dangerous, violent criminals? Like, that's the same game.
Yeah.
So some truckers are racist rednecks, so now all truckers are bad. That's the same game that is racism. They could play whatever discrimination of categorizing an entire group based on the actions of a few. You just have to be able to see that it's the same, whether it's based on race. A few, trans people do some bad things, so now all trans people are bad. A few truckers are bad, so now all truckers are bad. Like, celebrate some nuance here, that there are bad apples, whatever you want to say, or bad thinking people within every group.
Yeah, but for sure. But I think too, when you look at that whole scenario that happened, the most interesting part was that the rate of crime in Ottawa dropped during the trucker protest. There was less incidents of crime during that span.
What do you think? What do you attribute that to, you think?
Honestly, the truckers were, like, the vast majority of them were upstanding citizens. Like, they they were actually very smart too about everything that got tossed at them. For instance, there was a video got taken of one person peeing on, like, a war monument or something like that. And then obviously, yes, the news blows that up and runs with it. And, oh, look at how terrible these truckers are. Every day after that, there was groups of people shoveling off the monuments, laying flowers on them, decorating them, being like, awesome. No, this is what this group is about. Like, you can't paint it. Yeah, like you were saying, you can't paint us all this one way because of this one person. Yeah. So, and it was like any type of incident that happened, the group rallied around and definitely did their best to correct the narrative. But yeah, the media wasn't having any of it. And that's what's actually, going to something that's a hot topic right now, is it was impossible to get any mainstream unbiased coverage of the trucker protest because the CBC, which is the main news channel back home, gets over $1 billion of government funding. Like, over 50% of their revenue, like they said, it was under 70%, so you can probably assume it's somewhere in the 60s. So 60%, something like that, of their revenue directly comes from the government. No business, no matter what sector you're in, can afford to lose 60% of their revenue. Yeah. So how can you possibly expect them to cover these things objectively? What's even crazier is the whole Emergency Act, which got put through, which is a wartime measure, which has only ever happened twice in the history of Canada. It's the most extreme emergency powers that the government can take. That was completely based on CBC intelligence. Like, so they based those off of their justification for taking wartime measures were based off of journalism. Like, not their internals, like they weren't listening to their own internal intelligence agencies. It was off of this broadcasting company, and that's in their pocket.
Well, again, it makes sense. It's why CNN, when it says, like, Anderson Cooper brought to you by Pfizer, and then someone like Joe Rogan gets COVID, takes things that aren't Pfizer, gets better in 3 days and stuff, they have to disparage him because it's so clear. If someone is a sponsor, if I have a sponsor for the podcast of, like, Crystal Geyser water, okay, if I have Crystal, and then I'm like, oh, this tastes funky, like, I can't say that because if I count on that for my living, like, the whole structure is built on, I pay so that I get something in return that's positive for my corporation. And corporations, their whole goal is just to raise shareholder value. If once you bring that in, that's I think at the core of some of this corruption. The money in politics, the money that has to do with that. Like, where's the differences, I suppose? Because in America, we have super PACs, we have corporations can kind of operate independently as if they're an individual and stuff like that. But it's really tough to get rid of money in politics because is it money or influence? Rupert Murdoch was limited on how much he could, like, give, but he just created Fox News channel and empire that would just hammer the vote Republican, nail over and over and over again. The Rock has 250 million Instagram followers when he's like, yeah, go out there and vote for Kamala and Biden or whatever. Like, he might not have given money, but what do you give money for? Media attention and influence. So even if you shut down the dollar amount, you're still going to get influence. So how does it work there? Like, how does money corrupt politics there compared to America? You're pretty knowledgeable about this stuff. So, like, is it similar? Where is it different?
It's very similar. Yeah. It's pretty much the same. I think too, what like a portion that kind of gets left out of this whole conversation is the going to work for these corporations and stuff after the public sector.
Yes.
That I think is one of the most insidious aspects of it, because you look at the whole Pfizer, Moderna, all of these corporations, or even Raytheon and like all these other military companies, you look at their board of directors and their higher ups, and they're almost always used to be from the public sector. And it's like, how can we expect these people to do their job properly in the public sector when it's essentially a job, it's a 2 to 4 year job interview to go make a bunch of money in the private sector afterwards. So I think that's almost one of the biggest things, more than just kind of political campaign donations. But one thing I was kind of mentioning last night that was big about it is the amount of Chinese influence that's coming through.
Yeah, I want to touch on that because I wasn't even aware of that. So that's a big thing in Canada right now. Can you explain what's going on with like, Chinese influence?
So there was a bunch of money that I'm not sure the direct link that happened. I'm sure it was kind of like a Canadian company that's shelled by the CCP is donating to the Trudeau Foundation, because there's the Trudeau Foundation, which is like a nonprofit, same thing as like the Clinton Foundation, all this kind of stuff. I think Trudeau's dad, Pierre Trudeau, who was a prime minister back in the 80s, he started it. It just came out that there was a bunch of CCP money flowing through there, and now the CEO and almost the entire board of directors of the foundation has stepped down, and because it's starting to be brought to light how much money was going through there from the CCP. And then we also just had another MP in the Toronto area. His name was Han Dong, and
MP is member of parliament, not military police in America.
Right. Yeah, member of parliament. So he was essentially, a CCP shill as well. And the accusations are that the CCP was busing a bunch of Chinese people to this certain region of Toronto with literally his name all written on their arm, being like, this is the guy you're voting for. And now there's also accusations that this guy was advising the CCP not to release 2 Canadians that were being held in China and to then use them instead as a political bargaining piece. He's said that that's not true, but I mean, we'll see what comes out of there. But what's really interesting is that the corruption in our parliament is so deep, and this goes to the World Economic Forum, is because you can even go see videos of Klaus Schwab talking about how he's penetrated the cabinets and how over like 50% of these parties are actually World Economic Forum young global leaders is what they call them. They're just fully on board with the WEF. What's interesting is the NDP and Liberals are both very heavily influenced by the WEF, and you'll see Jagmeet Singh is the leader of the NDP party. Him and Justin Trudeau have an openly stated coalition with one another, because Trudeau had a minority government for the last 2 times he's been elected, and so essentially he can't ram things through Parliament like you would want to. So he gets a coalition with the NDP, which was essentially, okay, you guys vote on our favors however you want, however we want you to, and we'll give you funding for whatever projects you guys want. Like they wanted to expand dental care and all this kind of stuff, and all right, we'll just give you the money for that. It was paying for their parliamentary votes. Just now, there was a motion put through by the Conservatives in Canada to do an investigation into the Trudeau Foundation, and the NDPs and Liberals just shot it down. They're like, nope, we don't want. Don't look into it. So it's like it's completely top to bottom.
That's Chinese influence thing. Like you want to go on down a rabbit hole. Look up like university professor arrested for Chinese spy stuff.
Okay,
like secret, like Harvard, UCLA, like giving rocket technology, serving multiple life sentences for being treated. Like that gets brushed over, but there's a lot of examples. Because you're a college professor, you're doing super brilliant work. Someone from China comes over and they say like, we'll pay a ton of money, come over and work for us, or come over and do this thing. It's just, we're just sharing information here. Come on, let's go. Like, no problem. And it's a crazy, when you look at how many cases that is, and it doesn't get a lot of coverage. Trudeau, you mentioned Trudeau though. I've talked to several Canadian friends of mine, and they have all told me the same thing, which is I voted for Trudeau because he would legalize cannabis on a national level. Then I got this guy who's like crazy, and I really regret it. And that's happened over and over and over again that I've heard that story. And it makes sense to me because I think whether it's Biden or Trump or DeSantis or whoever, if one of them came out and said, we're going to change, cannabis and marijuana to away from a Schedule I drug, that would be huge. And I think people cross the line to vote for that because it's clearly the way like Schedule 1 drug. It's not a Schedule 1 drug. It has no medical benefit. That's patently untrue. And yet that's the way the standard is. But there's still people serving 30-year sentences in a cage, watching out the bars as someone's driving around a Bentley going to their dispensary that they're making tons of money on. But that was the case for you as well, right?
Yeah. I voted for Trudeau back in 2015 because back then I didn't. I mean, I graduated high school in 2012, so I was still practically a teenager at that point. So, at that point I was definitely a single issue voter.
That's a big issue though.
But
even if you're not a pot smoker, even if you're not, I think that's a big issue just from a common sense. You look at the war on drugs and how terrible it was. It still makes sense even if you don't like cannabis.
But yeah, objectively, every single marker for Canada has gone catastrophic since Trudeau got into office. Everything from even just our housing prices, all of it. It's just it's insane. He has raised the government debt by more than all prime ministers combined. So our country's debt in the last 8 years has more than doubled.
How does he stay? I mean, he's handsome. How does he stay in office? How does that?
Because of that coalition. He wouldn't be in office right now if the NDP didn't have an openly stated coalition. And Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the NDP, which is essentially our socialist party, but if you look at their rhetoric, they're just straight up communists. But he's fully on board with the World Economic Forum. He's even on the WEF website as well, listed on there. So I mean, they're on this greater agenda, this UN 2030 agenda as well. So I mean, you can even see videos and people think the UN is kind of this unbiased governing body and all this kind of stuff. And it's you can look at, there's a video of them talking about how the UN and World Economic Forum have signed a joint partnership to speed up the implementation of Agenda 2030. And there was a big presentation at the UN about this. Yeah. So it's they're full on. Yeah. I still have a hard time wrapping my head around how people don't see the dangers of that, where it's we have these highly influential corporations and the most powerful governing bodies in the world sitting there talking about implementing a joint social plan.
He made people watch the musical Hamilton or something like that. Alexander Hamilton was, an elitist. He's he was from the bottom, started from the bottom, now he's here. Type of guy. And those people who are those elites, they're I am the best and brightest, so I should have more power to manipulate things. But that doesn't mean that you have a moral compass. And if you're trying to aim for utopia, every single time someone aims for utopia, it ends up in horror, because by definition, if you're aiming for perfection, a perfect, fantasy, whatever it would be, a perfect world, then anything you do to get there is justified. So it's you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. So you can break a lot of eggs to make the greatest omelet ever eaten. And that's the danger of it. And part of this also that I want to talk about is the wokeness.
Yes.
Because Canada is, in some ways, on the national level, more woke. And I wonder if part of the reason is because you guys don't have a First Amendment. So you have something like the way that Jordan Peterson came to my attention, as he's a Canadian, is speaking out against that C-16 bill, the compelled speech bill, which essentially, for people that don't know, was part of a hate speech bill where it said if someone makes requests for their pronouns, that you have to honor that, otherwise it would be considered hate speech and it would be a form of violence or something like that, or it'd be harassment essentially if you don't honor their pronouns. And what Jordan Peterson stood up to was, he's wait a second, this is compelled speech. This is compelled speech, and that is a line that we just do not draw. We don't draw that in the Western world. We do not compel you to speech. It goes back to a Supreme Court case with Jehovah's Witnesses had to pledge allegiance to the flag, and they fought that no, you can't be forced to say certain words. The way I explain it in my class, Liam, is I say hey guys, what is that thing called that you when you go out, it's raining out, you put it over your head, and they're umbrella. I was oh, I call it a rain shield. They're what? I was yeah, rain shield. They're no, it's umbrella. I was okay, but if there was a law that says you have to call it an umbrella, you cannot, by punishment of fines or jail time, call it a rain shield, you would have to give middle fingers, be I can call this thing whatever I want. I have to use this. Saying you can't say certain things is different than you have to say certain things. That's the next step. And that is implemented now in Canada. And I think a dad got arrested for saying something on the stand, calling his trans son like a daughter or something along those lines. Like people have been locked up. In the UK, there's all these like non-crime hate incidences. People said stuff online and they spent time in jail. Like this is like a thing that Canada has. And I wonder if that's led to the woke stuff, the critical social justice stuff getting more out of hand in Canada. What does that look like day to day up there? And what are your thoughts on that, like, Ellen? Because you do speak out against wokeness.
I think it's too, and that's one of the things that I talk about is because, people will sit there and go like, well, why don't you, hate on like conservative culture more? And I'm like, don't get me wrong. Like there's more than enough you can criticize conservatives for. It's, it's even funny with me driving across America right now. It's like, I get a chuckle every time I see like the big, like Trump on the big side of a barn or something, all this kind of stuff.
There's a lot of that.
I'm like, there's just as much that I can make fun of there, but quite frankly, it's just not in my face, because there isn't a hardcore conservative culture in Canada. There just isn't. There's not a hardcore Christian base either. Like, it's not a thing there. So all we get is this extreme left-wing ideology of, whatever you want to call it, the woke ideology, and it's top to bottom taken over our institutions for sure. And that's why I rail against it so much more.
Is the alternative, the Conservative Party, you said it's like it's more reasonable than in some ways than, like, it's not extreme. Because I was wondering if sometimes when there's the ultra extreme, when there's like the Bernie, I don't even mind Bernie, but like Bernie, AOC kind of crew, then you have the extremes on the other side. You have the Trump or whatever, the MAGA crew, as like a rebuttal. But you said it's not really like that. Even though the left is very left, the right didn't seem to go very right to combat it.
No, like even like, I didn't even vote conservative in the last election either, because they were enforcing COVID mandates all the same. Like they were on board with the vaccine mandates and all that. Even when the debate was happening for climate change, they sat there and talked about all the sustainability implementations they're going to do and all this. And I was like, how are you guys any different? How are you guys considered opposition? You're just talking about doing the same thing they're doing, but maybe to a slightly lesser degree. But there was definitely no opposition to it. That being said, the new conservative leader that just got in, his name is Pierre Poilievre. He is definitely aligning himself a lot more against those ideas and saying like, no, I want to bring back, a big issue within Canada is the alienation of Alberta. Alberta's been talking for decades now about leaving Canada.
I have a lot of friends in like Calgary, Red Deer, places like that. A lot of my wife's, like, her industry, for whatever reason, like permanent makeup, it's like a hub of like North America is like permanent makeup in that. So I've been up there and everything like that. How would you describe it? It's like the Texas kind of Canada?
Yeah. And their economy is heavily dependent on oil production.
Cattle raising.
Yeah. Even look at the name of the Edmonton Oilers. So that's in their country, that's in their culture, and it's an integral part of their economy. And all of these regulations being put through by our parliament right now in Capitol Hill it's to the detriment of the Albertans for sure.
Yeah, and then go full circle back to we were talking about Rage Against the Machine. Blue collar workers, the hardworking, Canadians and Americans who come home smelling bad, grease, dirt on their shirts, just trying to do the right thing, working really hard, maybe uneducated, maybe they're from a tough upbringing or whatever like that. That is who is in the crosshairs of all this stuff.
Yeah.
That's what I think rubs me so wrong is like I got into teaching to not just to teach like the most privileged, but to go after like the kids who don't have a lot of opportunity and stuff like that. That's what got me into it. I ended up at a private school anyway because I was kind of chased out of the public school for talking about this stuff. Ironically, like who's gonna speak up for the dispossessed? That was always the left. The left was supposed to be the voice for the dispossessed. The right was supposed to be the voice for the hierarchy, saying we want the best brain surgeons and pilots and engineers so that society can advance. But when you get to those positions, you're going to naturally, stack the deck in the favor of your kids and your community and your friends. So that's going to be at the expense of the dispossessed at the bottom. Who's going to speak up for them? It was always the left. The left was supposed to be the voice for the dispossessed. And now the fact that they are also under the thumb of corporations, and they're also the ones who's in these institutions now? Universities and mainstream media and all of this kind of stuff is all Hollywood. It's all dominated by left, but they're not speaking for the working class. The people who are working at the New York Times are not doing stories about people in the trailer parks and stuff like that because they don't know anyone in the trailer parks. They're not from the trailer parks. They're doing unpaid internships. Who can afford an unpaid internship? People who don't have to worry about money. And this is just like what's happening over and over and over again. I worry about the blue collar workers, the laborers of our countries.
And yeah, it's the same thing. And, I think now the main difference is like, and I don't sit here and pretend like the conservatives are on the side of the people, whether it be in America or Canada. Like a lot of the stuff that Pierre Poilievre talks about is about giving, like one of his main talking points is giving people back control over their lives. And it's like, okay, maybe like I'll give you like, I'd like to see the shot for you to try it, but I don't have a lot of faith in the fact that that's what would happen.
Yeah.
But I think, now that there is no voice in the government on either north or south of the border that is sitting there and, looking out for the everyday folk, it is very elitist, and it's just what sectors those people care about, really.
Yeah. Yeah, they'll say it, but like, I mean, Trump will say it. And like, I know people, like I knew a guy from like South Carolina. He's like, I knew that Trump was a Yankee. I knew he had gold toilets, but at least he didn't vilify me. So he got my vote. But I think today I saw Matt Walsh, I think it was like the political punting guy saying like, I'm done with tipping. He's like, tipping's ridiculous. He's like, things are getting more and more expensive. And now they're asking for tips on top of this. It already comes back that it's the one that's already clicked is 20%. I'm done with tipping. It's like, have you ever worked like a service job? Like what? How elite, like that's exactly what like people would think like a cartoon of a conservative would say is like no more tipping for people who are like single moms who are tending bar to try and like cover their kids' food bill.
I actually, you know what? So I worked in the service industry for a while. I think I would actually probably agree with him mostly on that.
Tipping?
Not the no tipping. I don't go as far as the no tipping, but I do think tipping culture has got out of control. Like even, I mean, I'll go to like Subway and it's like there's a tip option.
Yeah.
You're like, wait, what? I'm not getting any service here. Like this is fast food.
That's just your job.
Nobody's cleaning up after whatever, all that kind of stuff. I also do think I worked in places in Toronto and like I was making $400 or $500 in cash a night. And it's like, I'm making more than doctors on a day-to-day basis. So I'm
Canadian doctors.
Yeah, true. Yeah, they're publicly funded. But yeah, so it's like I'm sitting here going in a lot of those scenarios, and I think, to be honest, what rubbed me the wrong way about it a lot was not necessarily the money, because it is hard work and it is stressful, and you just have people like the minute something goes wrong, they're looking for a reason to be shitty towards you. So it is a stressful job, not saying it's easy or anything, but I think what always rubbed me the wrong way was there was a lot of entitlement in that industry as well. Like if somebody got a 10% tip, then it was like the end of the world and those people are pieces of shit.
Yes.
And that. And then I was like, well, you're not entitled to that person's money. If you do good service, you'll get good money. Like, for sure. But so I'm at the point where I'm like, tipping is good. I do think people should get tipped because there should be an incentive to do your job better. But I also sit there and I go, I think it has gotten out of control.
Doesn't tip mean like to ensure it's like to ensure
proper service
or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. Like so. Yeah, so that's I guess that's where that's like the nuance of this concept, because I took it right away because I have a bias against him. I think that I was like, all right, this is an elite guy who has millions of dollars who doesn't want to give an extra $3 to his server or something like that. Like you should give $3 if you're in a position like his, maybe. But the other side of that, I hear you, which would be like how many? This would be interesting. You've been in the restaurant industry and stuff. Like when people come back, they got a really terrible tip. Is the first thing they do is they go, wow, how did I fail them as a server? No. And that's what it should be. It should be like, wow, I must have done something wrong. Because the only time I give a bad tip personally, I sometimes give bad tips. Our water was empty for 20 minutes. They got our order wrong. Like I asked for something specific, they didn't get it. Like whatever it is, like one thing after another. And I made requests. They weren't honored, so I lower the tip. And I try and write like a little note on it just to explain, because I kind of assume that they're just going to think that I'm an asshole and that's just what I tip. But my tip is directly correlated with the kind of service that I get. And I think if we address that with tipping, then maybe we can get back to something normal, which is like, 25% is reasonable. If it's like excellent service, amazing service, they're right on you all the time and treating you really well and have a smile. And then if they're not and they're negligent, then it's, 0 tip or 5%. Like that maybe would be something, but I don't know how much people reflect on it. Like, oh, it was my bad.
There's zero reflection. It's a lot of bitterness. And then two, honestly, they would have a lot more money. Like so whenever I first started bartending, I would go out with everyone afterwards and have drinks and all this kind of stuff. And then I realized, I was like, okay, I'm spending a lot of money doing this. That's the average bartender. The average bartender is spending the majority of their tips after each shift going and getting drunk themselves. And if they just stopped partying, like I never went out for the last about 3 years that I was working in the restaurant industry. And yeah, like I would see these servers sit there and be like, oh my God, I'm so broke right now. I'm like, how? You're making $250 a night. I see it. I know what you're making. How are you making $250 in cash every single night and you're broke? Yeah. Like that should be impossible with the year living scenario. It's not like these, like most of them didn't have kids or anything like that.
Yeah, it's just part of that lifestyle.
Yeah.
I guess the last thing I just want to touch on is pharmaceuticals. You did talk a lot about COVID, and we touched on a little bit with the truckers and stuff like that. But the mandates and stuff like that from Canada were more strict, would you say? More strict than America, especially because America had a federalist system, so each state was kind of different. So Florida was like, Florida's open, we don't have COVID, and Texas was open, but California was shut down. Like here, it was shut down pretty hard. One big difference that I see with pharmaceutical industry is we have direct consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals here. I think it's here and like New Zealand, but they have a lot of like stipulations on it. So it's really just America, like just commercial after commercial after 70% of news commercials are funded by Big Pharma or something like that. And you guys don't have that. But do you have the same issues that we're seeing with like pharmaceutical influence, even though it's not? So how do they get to the people?
So yeah, they can't advertise, but it's the same. I mean, this happens in America too, but it's the same thing where corporations put pressure on doctors to take back, whether it be rebates or kickbacks or whatever or subsidies is okay if you put out this. Yeah. I mean, a lot of doctors too, they're just sitting there. For instance, somebody in my family was going to get cancer treatment recently. They were talking about putting her on this very extreme medication, and she's very smart with all that kind of stuff. She's very health influenced. So she asked the doctor, like, hey, can I see the studies that this medication is based on? And they didn't even there was no peer review study for this medication. And so a lot of these doctors don't even know that. Like, have you ever seen the show Dope Sick?
No, I've heard about it.
Really good show. But they show that in that series, how these sales reps and these representatives from pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, I've read the John Abramson books, which are kind of similar.
Okay, yeah. So they essentially just show up at these doctors' doors, tell them all the, the marketing schemes of, oh, this is going to do this, and it's going to reduce inflammation by this percentage, or it's going to reduce, cancer by this, blah, blah, blah. And then the doctors just take them at their face value, and it's like, okay, this is what I prescribe now for this. So it's like, it's very similar for that.
And I wonder if doctors, because they do get paid less, like there's less money in medicine there, that if you have a lower salary, you've gone through all that schooling and stuff like that, are you more incentivized to, get some willful ignorance about what this drug could be if there's a monetary incentive? I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know exactly how that monetary incentive works in Canada compared to the States, because I know that there is actually just genuine kickbacks to the doctors. But yeah, I'm not sure what the legal stipulations are on that for Canada. But I mean, too, also, if you look at, a doctor that's, let's say, in a hospital in Canada, and he is or she is handcuffed to the protocols of that establishment, which are government protocols. So if they lobby, like if Pfizer goes up to Canada and lobbies our government and says, hey, this is what we think you guys should be doing for treatment, then the government imposes that on the doctors.
On all doctors, because all doctors are under government control. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So they essentially have to run a protocol from, we're allowed to use this medication, we're not allowed to use this medication.
See, that's the downside to socialized medicine is then you become essentially some form of like propaganda wing of the government through medicine then.
Yes. Yeah. And even too, like we have the assisted suicide is going crazy in Canada right now. Like it's now one of the top leading causes of death. Like top 10 is like literally assisted suicide.
Do you have to have like a terminal disease?
It started with that, and now it's just getting more and more. There was a news article that was recently done on a guy that was applying for assisted suicide because his government welfare was going to be cut in half or something like that. And he was like, my choices are I either die or I'm homeless. And he's like, I don't want to live on the street. And this was like on the news and stuff. And then you even see headlines being written about this, and it's like, oh, government assisted, or MAID is what they call it, but it's like assisted death could save the government $25 million a year from all this. And it's like, we've now too, there's been multiple instances of doctors saying, because they're not supposed to bring it up to the patient at all. The patient is the only one that's supposed to bring it up. But there's been multiple now where the doctors are like, hey, have you ever thought about this as an option?
Oh my
It's like they're putting it in people's heads.
Like, that's real. That reminds me of, I did a podcast with Mindy Churchill about Down syndrome. She adopted some Down syndrome. And in Norway, we've eradicated Down syndrome just through mass early testing that may or may not be accurate, and then mass abortion of Down syndrome kids. It's like, whoa, hold on. Someone's struggling. I don't want to be homeless. Ease them into killing themselves. That has, and I hate throwing this term out all the time, but it has the Nazi feel to it of getting rid of the dregs of society. Homeless people, let's push them to getting disabled people, mentally disabled people, Down syndrome people. Let's get like that is what Nazism was.
Yeah.
That's like the core idea. The strong survive and you crush the weak. They were wrong about what means weak. Like that's the disgusting part of Nazism, obviously. But the idea of just promote the strong and eradicate burn away the weak, like the Bessemer process making steel. That makes sense. Sense. It makes sense. It doesn't make any kind of moral sense, but it makes sense. And that stuff's happening now.
Yeah, it's happening. I'll send you a thing after this about there was an advertisement of a Canadian company that used assisted suicide as a marketing technique. Was like, they got this person that was applied for assisted suicide, and they're like, oh, how's she spending her last days? And her last days were all wrapped up in their products. And you're like, this is just a disgusting level of...
Yeah, and this is like the Western world, so I don't know, man. There's a lot. I could talk about this stuff all day, but that's why we connected online, share stuff online, always like keep up with each other's stuff. So where can you to direct people to your stuff? Because your Instagram account is really, really awesome. It's like I promoted at the beginning. I'm promoting it again. I'll keep promoting it because it's really great. It's lots of information. It's entertaining. It's quick. It's way more entertaining than my stuff. Mine's just like usually me talking on the phone. But you have all kinds of really cool graphics, really good ideas. You're knowledgeable on this stuff. Where can people follow that? And also, you have a newsletter. You have all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so you can find all of that through my Instagram, which is @liam.out.loud. And yeah, there's a typical link in bio thing that's got links to all my other platforms as well, where you can sign up for the newsletter, YouTube, all that shit. So.
Yeah, man, you do great work.
Thank
and
you,
you can also, people who are trying to get their stuff together, they can also hire you for more videography work to kind of do what you do for like whatever products they have and stuff like that too. And I've used some of your stuff before. It's really, really great. So I appreciate you being here, man. I'm glad we got to do this conversation.
Yeah, me as well.
It was really great. And thank you guys for listening.
If you enjoy these kinds of complex conversations and want to try to apply them in your own life, check out my free download, Debate to Dialogue, a guide on having productive conversations on religion and politics. It's available at www.cylinderradio.com/debate to dialogue.